Now, on the way up, I met someone who thought Yves Congar was going to actually be here. So I'd like initially to assure you that I'm not Yves Congar, even though I may look old enough to be him. My name is Bob Newton. I'm the interim director of the Church in the 21st Century Center, and I'm special assistant to the president of Boston College, Father Leahy. Let me welcome you to this, our fourth event in our fall program for the center. If you haven't received or taken a copy of the C21 resources, I encourage you to do so, because right in the center you'll find the program of events that we sponsor and co-sponsor for the fall. C21 resources comes out once a semester, and this year, as you may have noted, the theme is Grace and Commitment, the vocations of the laity, religious, and the ordained. And obviously the emphasis at this symposium is on Yves Congar and his ideas about the vocation of the laity. So if you look both at this program and you look at the program that we will be announcing in the fall when we publish the C21 resources for the spring, you'll find plenty of events that develop those themes. The other thing I'd like to do is suggest that, as I was standing at the table, we asked someone who just arrived from Bridgeport, did she have a copy of C21 resources? And she said, I don't need a copy. And she didn't, because she said, I get everything from the center online. And so I'd like to remind you that virtually everything we do is online. And you can find a copy of this document or this publication online. So if you, we found out that most people who receive it eventually hand it on physically to someone else. But there's another way to share the kind of information and ideas that are in here, and that's to direct people to our website, where you can click on an icon and you've got C21 resources actually very attractively reproduced, just like this. Our website is intuitive, so you don't have to write it down. It's basically www.bc.edu and then /Church21. And you'll find all sorts of interesting things on the website. We had a commitment from the very beginning, which I think through Karen and Paul we're really implementing more effectively these days, of assuming that the resources that the number of people who will actually come to the Boston College campus, who can afford to come, given time and distance and all that, will be a very small number, even though since the beginning we probably had about 50,000 people at our various events. But 50,000 in a Catholic population in the United States of how many? 80 million isn't even a drop in the bucket. So we have a commitment to having a very robust website and to try to communicate with audiences who can't physically be here, whatever resources we create. So it's important for you to know that, because I think that's a way in which you can even if you can't come, you can discover and use the resources that we have on our website. For example, today's talk will be on our website. Today's two talks will be on our website in approximately 2 weeks, say October 15th. So if you want to refer someone to the talk, you can simply go to the URL and it will be there. Final thing I want to do is just welcome our two speakers. Arlie Hagstrom from Providence College and Laurie Johnston from Emmanuel College. And let me tell you that they're both coming back to the Heights because they're both alumni of Boston College. Laurie receiving her doctorate just a few years ago in our theology department, and Arlie receiving her master's degree in our Institute for Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry, or was it a theology?
Scripture.
In Scripture. So in our theology department back in the mid-'80s. So I'm going to introduce Karen Kiefer, without whom nothing would happen. I found out in the Church in the 21st Century Center, who will introduce our two speakers. But welcome back to the Heights, and welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Bob.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming this morning. Speaking of Yves Congar, I was telling Laurie and Arlie this morning that I said to my middle schooler that we were having a conference this morning on Yves Congar, and she said to me, "Is that the fashion designer?" So anyway, we welcome you back to the Heights. Before we get started, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping details. For the restrooms, right out the back, through the hallway to the right. There'll be, refreshments and plenty of food and everything throughout the morning. The way that the morning's going to go is, first up at bat is Professor Hagstrom. So she will speak. She will speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then do a little give and take. And then we're going to take a quick break, come back, and then Professor Johnston will speak. And then she will speak for about the same amount of time, do a little give and take, and then come back. And then we're going to do some really nice workout sessions at the end of the morning. So it should be a really special morning. I have to say I have such great respect for all of you for being here today, because we all know that Yves Congar is such a pioneer and such an influential figure. Not only in the 20th century, but now. And even though my middle schooler doesn't know who he is. One of the things that is so certain about his mission and his ministry is how much he loved the church. And I think your presence here today speaks to how much you love our church. So thank you so much. I have the great honor of introducing throughout the morning two pioneers, two theologians right here. Miss Orly Hagstrom, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about her in 2 minutes. But as far as her pioneering ways, she has been the chairperson of 2 theology departments in the first female chair, which is really wonderful. And Laurie Johnston is just amazing grace in action, and is also the mother of 3 children while she was getting her doctorate. She also traveled this summer to Trent, Italy, to attend a conference, having just given birth to her child, and brought the baby with her, and teaches, and also is an avid hockey player. So we're going to learn a lot more about these women and their work. But let me give Arlie some proper introduction. And her vitae is long, so this is short. She is the Associate Professor of Theology at Providence College, again, the first female chair of her department. Her STD is in Dogmatic Theology from the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, Italy. She taught theology for 11 years at the University of St. Francis in Joliet, Illinois, and she served as chair of the theology department there. Her publications include The Vocation and Ministry of the Laity and an article on the theology of the laity in the New Catholic Encyclopedia. Dr. Hagstrom serves as a theological consultant for the United States Catholic Bishops' Committee on the Laity. She has lectured in the United States and in Europe on theology of the laity. Currently, her work is focused on the reality of ecclesial lay ministry in the church. She has recently led seminars at the U.S. Catholic Bishops on the U.S. Catholic Bishops document, Co-Workers in the Vineyard, a resource for guiding the development of lay ecclesial ministry. Her latest book, The Emerging Laity, Vocation, Mission, and Spirit, has just been published by Paulus Press, and actually we will have it on sale later on this morning. So with further ado, I welcome Miss Orly Hagstrom.
I had to walk around because, as you'll learn soon enough, Laurie has a hockey injury that keeps her on crutches for the moment. There should be a handout on your table just for the very simple outline of my presentation this morning. Faithful and Free, Yves Congar and the Vocation and Mission of the Laity. You got that handout? There won't be a quiz, don't worry. Just something to follow along with. Write your grocery list on or whatever's on your mind this morning. Call your bookie and make that bet on Boston College tomorrow's game. Go Eagles. So as Karen said, my name is Arlie Hagstrom, and I teach at Providence College. I'm actually also a graduate of PC, and then did 2 years here. Bob, it was the late 80s, please, the late 80s when I was at Boston College, not the early 80s, where I did a degree in Scripture, and then I worked for the Archdiocese of Boston for a year before I went off to Rome for 4 years, where I pursued a doctorate in dogmatic theology. How did I get interested in the theology of the laity? Well, when I went to Rome and started attending classes for the licentiate degree, in the classrooms at the pontifical universities, I was typically the only woman and definitely the only layperson in the room. And being put into that experience of being a minority member, that is, as a layperson, rather than as a majority member of the church, which is pretty typical, got me thinking about what exactly is the lay vocation. There's nothing like sitting in a classroom of seminarians or newly ordained priests to get one thinking about, well, what is the role of the laity in the church when it comes to notions of vocation and mission? While in Rome, I lived at an international co-ed student house for lay people called the Lay Center at Foyer Unitas. And at that time, we were located in Piazza Navona, which is a great front yard to have. Not very conducive to study, however. At the Lay Center at Foyer Unitas, the 12 or 16 of us who lived together in those years would often at table share about our experiences during the day at the pontifical universities. There are 5 universities in Rome, and the 14 or 16 of us actually sort of spanned all the disciplines. And usually we had someone in the house studying at all 5 universities. We call the Lay Center at Foyer Unitas a kind of laboratory of lay spirituality, or sort of a hothouse for a theology of the laity, because we were living together, sharing chores, sharing table fellowship meals, praying together. And in that experience of talking to people from other parts of the world with very different experiences of church, you could begin to craft a notion of a theology and a spirituality of the laity. And so it was really the lived experience of being in Rome in those years, being a student at the pontifical universities, living in an intentional Christian community of laymen and women, that helped me to choose a topic for my doctoral dissertation, and the topic was the vocation and mission of the laity. And so for the last 20 years or so, this has been the topic of my thinking, my research, my writing, and my teaching. This morning I've been asked to speak about the vocation and mission of the laity in a very particular way, that is according to the theology of Father Yves Congar, who I might mention was a Dominican. I love to say that here in the bastion, the bad boy bastion of Jesuit theology. So I'm happy to be representing Providence College, a fine Dominican institution just down the road about an hour, here at the Jesuit stronghold of Boston College. The best way, I think, to learn about the teaching of Congar on the vocation and mission of the laity, I usually actually point my students just to the documents of Vatican II, since it's impossible to understand the conciliar teaching without first understanding the teaching of Congar himself. He has such a huge influence on the conciliar teaching. Well, where would you find the teaching on the laity from the council? There are 2 basic places you would look. The first place is in the document on the church, Lumen Gentium, chapter 4. So Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the church, has an entire chapter devoted to the laity. And after that constitution was published, the Council Fathers decided to publish another document, in fact, a separate decree, on the apostolate of the laity, Apostolicum Actuositatem, the decree on the apostolate of the laity. Remember, we used to use that word apostolate? Now we say mission, but in those days that was the cutting-edge word, apostolate. And without a doubt, the thought and writings of Father Yves Congar had a decisive influence on the development of the theology that you're going to find in Lumen Gentium, and then how it's worked out in the decree on the apostolate Apostolicum Actuositatem. Some of the questions that arose on the floor of the council in their debates about the nature of the church were, first of all, who are the laity? This is one of the first questions the council fathers are asking. How do we describe the laity? Another question, where do the laity get their call and authority for mission in the church and in the world? So who are they? And then where do they get their authorization for mission in the church and in the world? Once those questions started to be debated, things got even more interesting. What is it that makes the mission or the apostolate of the laity unique or different from that of the clergy or religious? Is there anything that makes their mission distinctive, unique, different from clergy and religious? Do the laity share in the apostolate of the hierarchy? Is there some way that the laity can share in the mission or apostolate of the hierarchy? Or do they just share in the one saving mission of the church itself? So is it a sharing in someone else's apostolate, or is there simply one mission that the whole church has and the laity have their own unique sharing in that? Did Jesus entrust his mission on earth only to the hierarchy? And then everyone else in the church simply shares in the hierarchical apostolate in some fashion? Or is there just one mission of the church that everyone shares in regardless of vocation? Well, you can see that these are very penetrating questions that are being debated on the floor of the council in the early and mid-60s. Because it gets right down to what is the theology of mission? How do we understand identity in the church? Is the very nature of the church that of mission? Are we a church with a mission or a mission with the church? Well, the first question, who are the laity? There wasn't a lot of information in past conciliar teaching on the laity. And so the Periti, the theologians of the council, who are famous for running into the archives and looking for what have we said in the past about this topic, they found that there's not a lot to work with at the beginning of Vatican II. In fact, for nearly 400 years, there's barely a trace of church teaching on the laity before Vatican II. It had been since Trent that the church had said anything in council concerning the laity, and even in that context, in the Tridentine teaching, it was about marriage and penalties for clergy who, for certain crimes, were reduced to the lay state. So it was a canonical teaching, a legal teaching, what happens if clergy is removed from ministry and then they are reduced to the lay state. That's about all that they said about the laity for 400 years. And so 400 years later, now the church says, oh, yeah, as we were saying to the laity. Let's get back to that conversation. So there's not a lot there for them to begin to work with at the Second Vatican Council. At best, vocation of the laity was defined in a negative fashion. That is, the laity, well, they're everyone who is not ordained and not religious, not in holy orders, and not bound by the 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. That's usually how the laity were described. Well, these are some of the very same questions that were posed by Yves Congar in his work on the eve of the council. One of the first systematic attempts to articulate a theology of the laity is made by Congar in 1953 in his monumental study, Lay People in the Church, which is still an indispensable work referencing theology of the laity today. Lay People in the Church, 1953. This book is really a whole ecclesiology focused on the laity. Congar says in the introduction to that important book, quote, "At bottom, there can only be one sound and sufficient theology of the laity, and that is a total ecclesiology, unquote." Now, Congar does not claim to craft or produce a total ecclesiology, but he did try to present the role of the laity in the church in positive and dynamic terms. So this morning, I'd like to highlight for you 4 separate themes in Congar's writings, 4 aspects of his theology of the laity, which then help to shape the discussion and the documentation of the Second Vatican Council. And these are on your sheet. The first one is the vocation of the laity. Secondly, we'll look at the biblical model of people of God. Third, the mission of the laity. And finally, the secular character of the laity. So let's start with vocation. First, the understanding of the vocation of the laity is fundamental to Congar's work. I mean, you have to start there. Who are the laity? And in his theology, Congar says immediately he wants to reject 2 popular views of the laity at that time. First, he's going to reject the medieval notion of the laity that defined the laity as a class over against the clergy. He wants to reject that medieval notion of a class over and against the clergy. Secondly, Congar also wants to reject the monastic view. First the medieval, then the monastic view that held that laity existed by virtue of a concession to weakness. So from the monastic point of view, the laity are those who could not live the monastic life. They exist by virtue of a concession to human weakness. You know, they got married. As if that's a concession to human weakness. So from the medieval point of view, more the canonical view, or the monastic point of view, looking at the laity through the lens of monastic or ascetical life, these 2 views, Congar on purpose says, I want to move beyond. I want to move beyond this negative, not clergy, not religious approach to the laity. Here's what he says, and I quote, "The whole point of this book is a protest against reducing the layperson's proper quality to being a reference to the world or to temporal things. Still less have we ever admitted the absurdly oversimplified formula, quote, spiritual things appertain to the priest, while temporal things to the layman, unquote." So here he's rejecting those 2 views as if the clergy are ordered towards spiritual things and the laity are only ordered towards temporality, towards the world. He says his whole book is a protest against defining the laity by one of these 2 older models. Not clergy and not religious. And so at the floor of the Second Vatican Council, the Council Fathers said, well, can we move beyond a negative description of the laity as not this or not that? Could we start in a positive way, who they are, rather than beginning with the not this and not that? And they follow here the lead of Yves Congar, who moves away from the defining of the laity as existing only by nature of a concession to human weakness or negative creatures who have no part in the power of jurisdiction, and especially that of holy orders. So what's called the monastic view or the canonical view. Congar says in his book, the laity, just like clergy and monks, are, quote, ordered to heavenly things, unquote. The laity are also ordered to heavenly things. But the way they pursue this end is different from that of clerics or monks. So everyone is ordered to this end, this heavenly end. What do I mean by that? Heavenly union with God, holiness, participation in the mission of Christ. Okay, that's the end. Holiness, union with God, participation in the mission of Christ. And Congar says everyone is oriented to that end. But the way they get there is distinctive. There are different ways, different from the clergy or the monastic life. Well, what's different about it? Congar says the laity are called to make this pilgrimage towards their heavenly end in the world, that the world is the site of their pilgrimage. Now, he admits in the text that this is an anthropological description of the laity, but he thinks it's very important to inform a theological description of the laity, that this anthropological description should inform the theological description and get us away to a purely legal or canonical definition of the laity. So if we move away from the canonical language, the legal language that in the past was used to define laity, for example, in the 1917 Code of Canon Law, then he thinks we need to start with this anthropological reality and then move on to a theological description. So, ordered to a heavenly end, called to do God's work in the world. Here's what he says, and again I quote, "The laity have their own vocation in the church, more exactly, in the work of the church militant. For it is only in the church's earthly phase, characterized by the existence of an apostleship and by the distinction between church and world, that the laity has a particular vocation. The heavenly calling to the glory of the kingdom is to lay and cleric alike. There is a calling to apostleship that is made to all Christians without distinction, that namely is associated with baptism," unquote. So a few things about this lengthy quote. The heavenly calling to the glory of the kingdom is made to lay and clergy alike, i.e. there are no second-class citizens in the church. Without distinction, the calling of apostleship is given to all Christians. So there's mission again, there's apostleship. So heavenly end and apostleship or mission without distinction. And where does he root all of this? He roots it in a theology of baptism. One of the major advances in the theology of the laity provided to us by Yves Congar, Dominican, is a reclaiming of the New Testament teaching on baptism. He digs into the New Testament teaching, the teachings of St. Paul concerning baptism. And by digging down deeply into our tradition, into Scripture, he hits the energy source for renewal. He drills down deeply into the tradition and Scripture, and he hits all the spiritual energy we need to reform and renew the church. You know, when my students at PC say, "Oh, they're frustrated, they're impatient with the church, they wish the church would do this or move in that direction. How are we going to get there?" And I always say the same thing: drill deeper. Drill deeper down into the tradition, and you're going to find all the spiritual resources you need for renewal. Drill down deeper into Scripture, and you're going to find all the spiritual energy you need for renewal. You don't need to look outside the church in political science or sociology, as important as those disciplines are. Drill within our own tradition. Look at the saints. Look at how radical they are. I mean, the little flower who's supposed to be the shy, unassuming saint that we celebrate today, she's a powerhouse. She told us you could be holy in ordinary life. You could fold sheets in the laundry for the sake of the kingdom, and it could help missionaries in China. That's a deep spiritual insight she had of spiritual solidarity in the church. And she's this kid, a spoiled kid, in a monastery that no one would ever know. And she writes a little journal, and it rocks the world. She's the patroness for mission. So drill deeply down into the tradition, and you'll find all the spiritual energy you need. Congar drills down to baptism. And he says, here's where we need to ground an understanding of the vocation of the laity, and in fact, everyone in the church. Putting baptism back into the center is what Congar does. The second aspect of his theology of the laity is his use of the biblical model of the kingdom of God. And he defines it as people of God. Because he's talked about church and kingdom now, where the laity have this intersection point. But he's going to reclaim the biblical notion of people of God. And of course, we find this as early as Exodus 19 at the Mount Sinai covenantal ceremony, and we find it in 1 Peter in the New Testament. People of God. And by employing, again, drilling down into the tradition, finding people of God in the Bible, Congar can now develop the notion of the laity's participation in the primary religious mission of the church. How is he going to work this out? He's got vocation from baptism. What about mission? Well, he starts with this biblical model of the people of God. That's his point of departure. Now, why was this so radical in 1953? Because in ecclesiology, the most common description for the church at the time was a legal one, a canonical one, a political one. The church is an unequal society. This goes all the way back to Trent and beyond. The church is an unequal society. That's what he's replacing now with people of God, a biblical idea. Or the church was known as those, what I call the old power pyramid model, defined by jurisdictional power, those who had jurisdictional power, that is based on holy orders, and those who did not. Those who were not in the sacrament of holy orders, and therefore did not possess jurisdictional power, so hence the unequal society. So this is what Congar is reacting to with reclaiming this rich biblical notion that goes as far back as Exodus, the people of God. What happens when you replace unequal society with people of God? A lot of things. The context of the biblical model of the people of God enables Congar to outline the participation of the laity in the mission of the church. Here's what he says, and I quote, "The starting point is now the idea of the people of God, the whole of it active, the whole of it consecrated, the whole a witness and sign of the purpose of God's grace for the imparting of that purpose to the world. The whole living people of God has a structure. Thus, the hierarchical fact is set within this whole people of God, living and sent, but without dividing its mission into specialized parts." He continues, "There are particular forms of exercise of the church's mission, but there is no particular mission differentiating the faithful and the ministerial priesthood." Unquote. So he says there are particular ways of exercising the mission, particular ways of participating in the mission. But there aren't different missions for laity and clergy. So he says in this above quote that the people of God has both a structure and a life. This is a people that is structured, ordered, and it has a life. Distinguishing sharply between the structure of the church, what he calls the institution of salvation, and the life of the church, what Congar calls the community of salvation. Now he can consider the laity in terms of their participation in the life of the church through the three offices of priest, prophet, and king. And Congar spends a lot of time in this book looking at the three offices of Christ as priest, prophet, and king. It's a rubric that goes all the way back to the Reformation and beyond, thinking about how the entire church continues these three offices of Christ. But see, in the past, there really wasn't theologizing on how the laity in particular participate in these three offices. So now he's working in some Christology as well. What does it mean to say Christ is priest, prophet, and king? How do those three offices continue in the life of the people of God? And how do the laity, in their own way, participate in those three offices? So now he's reclaiming a Christology. Again, drill down in your tradition. He's claiming a Christology that can bear the burden of this theology of laity that he's crafting. How do the laity participate in the three offices of Christ as priest, prophet, and king? They do it through their baptism. Baptism plunges us into these three offices. Again, it had been popular to think in the past that only the clergy really participated in these three offices through holy orders. That holy orders was the way that one participated in Christ as priest, prophet, and king. And now Congar is reclaiming baptism, this New Testament teaching again, to say that this is the entry. This is the way we participate. We're plunged into this, to Christ through our baptism, priest, prophet, and king. By thinking about the people of God, and by giving us a theology of the three offices of priest, prophet, and king, the laity now are seen by Congar as being central to the life of the church, not periphery, not second-class citizens, not an add-on, not just the extras who are left over after we have priest and religious, but central to the life of the church. What Congar is doing is he's putting baptism back into the center of a system that had holy orders at the center. He's crafting an ecclesiology based on baptism rather than a whole ecclesiology with its starting point, holy orders. So where do you get when you start your ecclesiology with holy orders, and everyone is referenced to that, everyone has to be defined in reference to that, versus where do you go when you start your ecclesiology with baptism? I usually explain it to my students at PC this way. If you think about the Catholic sacramental system as a kind of wagon wheel, where you have the hub of the wheel and then all of these spokes that emanate from the hub. And in the past, the hub of the wheel was holy orders. And everything had to be defined in reference to that, stemming from the primary theology of holy orders. What Congar does is he takes that hub of the wheel out and he replaces it with baptism. What happens when you do that? What happens when your starting point is no longer holy orders, but a theology of baptism coming from St. Paul in the New Testament? In the context of the biblical metaphor, people of God, well, you get a different ecclesiology. And you get a New Testament ecclesiology. And you get a Pauline ecclesiology. I mean, in my mind, what Vatican II does for us is it reclaims Paul. Look at all the footnotes in Lumen Gentium that are from Paul's writings. It's the most biblical council ever. Every second line in Vatican II is a biblical citation or reference because of the biblical studies renewal that was going on in the church in the early and middle part of the 20th century. And look how Pauline the theology of the church is in Vatican II. Why did we need to reclaim Paul? Because Martin Luther took him down the street 400 years ago and started a different church. Right? Protestantism is Pauline. It's completely Pauline. Right? Go to the local Protestant bookstore, most of the books, St. Paul. Right? Because Luther's reading Paul, thinking about Paul, has an insight about Paul and justification and grace, and it shapes his entire view of the church, of spirituality. Right? Protestantism is very Pauline. That break that happens in the 16th century, to me, is a separation of Peter and Paul. Because what did we hang on to? Sacraments, papacy, Eucharist, the keys, the Vatican. We're very Petrine. And Paul's like an afterthought. And Protestantism, very Pauline. All things to all men, evangelization, the Word of God, personal relationship with Jesus Christ, charisms for everyone. That's Paul. And what happens at Vatican II is we're welcoming Paul back home after 400 years. Welcome home, Paul. Guess where John the 23rd announced his intention to have a council? At the tomb of St. Paul, on the feast of the conversion of Paul, January 25th, 1959. He's out at the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. And after the papal liturgy that day, he gives a talk to the Curia before they all go to lunch at the Benedictine house. And he says, you know what, I'm going to have an ecumenical council. And they thought he was crazy, and he was. He was crazy, and the Lord used that for the renewal of the church. So there's John standing at the tomb of Paul saying, we're going to have a council. I don't think this is an accident. I think the Holy Spirit is at work in this. And Paul comes back home at Vatican II. It's a very Pauline council. And that's why if you ask Catholics right after the council, what do you think of the changes at Vatican II? And they'd say, I don't know, I don't like it so much. Well, why not? I feel like we're becoming too... You got it. And they were right. They have an insight there. That's an intuition. We're becoming Pauline again. We're becoming Pauline. You know, one of the most ancient titles for the Bishop of Rome, successor to Peter and Paul. We forgot that for 400 years. Paul's buried in Rome too. He's martyred there too. Our church is based on these two, and the entire New Testament is based on these two. Peter's the main character of the Gospels. Paul's the main character of the rest of the New Testament. So why were we only going with half the story? So here's Congar reclaiming St. Paul, baptism back at the center, and it's a New Testament theology that gives laity a central identity and role in the church. That's my Reformation course in 5 minutes. It's Peter and Paul. It's like the Council of Jerusalem all over again. Okay, the third aspect is the understanding of for Congar, is this notion of secularity, or the secular character of the laity. Now, Congar is a pioneer in this sense. He says that the secularity of the laity is a very positive thing. And he affirms the secular character or nature of the laity as being an unequivocal contribution to the life and mission of the church. This is a positive contribution that laity bring to the table in the church. Because, Congar would say, the laity are those Christians who take secular structures and the temporal order seriously, the inner nature of things seriously, so that the laity's contribution to the kingdom of God is made in and through their commitment to the temporal secular order. This is precisely their contribution to the kingdom within the secular temporal order. What's going on here? Remember, laity used to be defined by, well, the laity are in the world. And that was not a positive evaluation of laity in the past, right? Because the question is, what is your view of the world? This is also debated at the council. Usually in Catholic spiritual writings, the world was worldly, that is a negative, right? Something opposed to the gospel, something not holy, something that gave in to the desires of the flesh. This is a particular reading of John's gospel, right? Where Jesus himself says, I've called you out of the world. Don't worry if the world hates you. It hates me first. Satan is the prince of this world, right? So there's a reading of John's gospel where the world is very negative. It represents all of those forces of evil that are against Jesus and against the gospel, and eventually against the church. And so in the past, when we said, well, laity, they live in the world, that was a negative evaluation. Worldly. Secularity was not a compliment. They get mixed up in the affairs of the world is contaminated, it's sinful. So what we do once a week is we drag them into the church, we hose them down with holy water, we feed them the Eucharist, and we send them back out again for 6 days to battle the dragons. Am I wrong on this? So if you're in the world, you're raising kids, you're paying bills, you're working, that's not the call to holiness. Right? That's not the ascetical idea of the 3 vows. So Congar turns this on its head and says, no, let's look at another reading of John's gospel. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that anyone who would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. God created the world. God loves the world. God is in the process of redeeming the world. So Congar pulls that strand out of the New Testament and says, here's how we need to understand lay secularity, the secular character of the lay vocation and mission. The laity are those who have their own proper calling to serve God and fulfill the church's mission, particularly through engagement in temporal tasks. And that's quoted nearly word for word in Lumen Gentium. What does this mean? It means that your daily, ordinary life as a layperson is itself the context for your mission. That you don't need to look anyplace else except for your own daily life and combine that with your baptismal identity, and that equals mission. My baptismal identity plus my daily life equals my mission. It's a simple equation. Once you see the world as a positive, once you understand secular nature as a positive, my baptismal identity plus my daily routine equals mission. So you mean to tell me that cutting the grass, coaching this Little League team, paying bills, working a job, changing diapers, voting, that's my mission as a layperson? And Congar would say, yes, that's it. Get down and dirty about it. That's your mission. That's your context. That's how God wants to redeem you and the world, through your daily, humdrum, mundane activities that now take on a high spiritual value in the perspective of this notion of mission. That there's nothing outside of the daily family, work, life of the laity that cannot be used, that needs to be appealed to for the mission. It's within the context of daily life. Well, what about people in the monastery who get up at 2 a.m. and pray every night? Aren't they holier? Well, if you have a baby in the house, you're up at 2 a.m. and you're praying. You have a sick child? You have a teenager with the car for the first time? It's midnight and you're up and you're praying. Where is he and where is that car and where are those keys? So lay spirituality is, Congar would say, not second-class citizenship. Right within our daily routine is the opportunity to grow in holiness and to further the kingdom of God. Congar says, since part of the church's mission is influence upon temporal civilization, then this mission is fully exercised only through the lay people doing their own part in it. They are irreplaceably the church for a whole order of ecclesial activities. So this secular character becomes critical even for Lumen Gentium's teaching on the laity and also that decree on the apostle of the laity. How to think about secular character as a contribution and not a handicap for laity in their vocation and mission. The final aspect of Congar's theology of the laity, which I'll outline this morning for our discussion, is the notion of mission. Now, a debate comes up on the floor of the council. How do we understand a theology of mission? A very popular and traditional way of understanding mission was this. The risen Jesus passed on his mission before the ascension. Right? Look at those commissioning scenes at the end of all four Gospels. Behold, I'm with you always to the end of the earth, end of the age, in Matthew. Go and be my witnesses at the end of Luke. Teach everything I've proclaimed to you. So in the Gospels, we find that the risen Jesus commissions the apostles. He passes on his mission to them. And so a traditional understanding of mission was that only those who are the successors of the apostles are responsible for mission. He gives it to the apostles. Now we have successors of the apostles, and they have the primary responsibility for the mission of the church. It was called the hierarchical apostolate. The hierarchical apostolate. And it makes a good deal of sense based on those scripture passages. Priests could share in that apostolate because they were in a kind of deputized by their local ordinary, by the local bishop. Where does that leave the laity? No mission. No mission. Doesn't belong to us. We're not responsible for it. We don't participate in it. Catholic action, which was very popular in the early 20th century, leading right up to Vatican II, was defined this way. Laity who are authorized to share in the hierarchical apostolate by their local bishop. So it was a lay movement, right, in Europe, also here, not as popular, where laity were authorized to share in the hierarchical apostolate of their local bishop. But notice, it wasn't their mission. It wasn't their responsibility. They were sharing in the hierarchical apostolate. Catholic action had this idea, the laity are the right arm of the clergy in the world. We were the right arm of the clergy in the world. This changes on the floor of the council, because this theology was presented, certainly. Should we stick with this theology, hierarchical apostolate, based on these commissioning scenes at the end of each gospel? And the Preti said no. There's another way to think about mission in the New Testament. Guess who it comes from? Paul says baptism is the mission sacrament, not holy orders. Mission is linked to baptism in the New Testament. Charisms are linked to baptism, and charisms empower you for mission. See, in this old way of thinking, charisms were connected to holy orders. Because they had to do the mission, they received charisms in the sacrament of holy orders to equip them for the mission. It makes a lot of sense. Did anyone else get charisms? Cardinal Sunins asked on the floor of the council. Don't we have in church history lay people receiving charisms? And he said, what about the saints? Haven't we always had a tradition in the church where lay people also have received charisms, and we see it displayed, showcased in the tradition of the saints? So when they go back to St. Paul, welcome home, Paul, they go to those beautiful passages in Galatians and Philippians where he speaks about all are one in Christ, neither Greek nor Jew, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female. You have received the one Spirit. All of you have received gifts for the body. You might be an eye or a hand or an ear. They reclaim that beautiful Pauline theology of baptism, charisms, and mission. And now the lay mission is seen as a participation in the one mission of the church. There aren't separate missions. The hierarchy gets one, we get one, religious gets one. There's one mission, and everyone is plunged into it through their baptism. and through the charisms that we receive. According to Congar, the laity's authorization for mission is grounded in their sacramental identity. And the sacraments are baptism and confirmation, right, confirmation. He says baptism and confirmation equip the laity for mission in the church and in the world. This is nothing new. It's founded on the teaching even of Aquinas concerning sacramental character. The sacramental character of baptism and confirmation incorporate the recipient in different measures into the priesthood of Christ, according to Aquinas. So this incorporation into the body through the sacramental identity of the two sacramental characters of baptism and confirmation are all the authorization the laity need for mission. That is sufficient. You don't need a letter of permission from your local ordinary. You don't need to be invited to participate in a hierarchical mission, because there is only one mission. And all of us share in it according to our vocation. We all share in it in different ways. In a particular way, Congar found support for the idea of confirmation as a mission sacrament in the teachings of St. Thomas. According to Aquinas, the sacrament of confirmation makes the individual what he calls a perfected Christian, an active member of the church, empowered to witness and defend the faith. Confirmation, according to Aquinas. I always joke that confirmation is one of these sacraments in search of a theology. And depending on what diocese you're in, you have a different theology of confirmation. You know, is it a puberty rite? Is it a graduation from CCD? Is it a service award? My nephew's making confirmation. You know, they just keep upping the service hours, like that's what confirmation is. So anyway, Aquinas gives us a theology of mission that is helpful for Congar and perhaps for us. Here's what Congar says. St. Thomas sees in confirmation both the sacrament which completes the fidelis as a Christian and as one of consecrations which settle and arrange the various offices in the church. Congar continues. St. Thomas goes so far as to show the confirmed person as being constituted a defender and witness of the faith, so that the Christian is qualified for general Christian life, pure and simple by baptism, and for certain activities of the church by other sacraments, which constitute him in offices or ministries, by confirmation for the church's militant life, unquote. So pure and simple Christian life, Aquinas says that comes from baptism, but activities of the church, this comes through confirmation. So no need for any further authorization as far as Congar's theology is concerned, based on Aquinas, that confirmation and baptism are the sacraments for vocation and mission. In summary, we can say that Congar's pre-conciliar description of the laity highlights these elements of vocation, membership in the people of God, secular character, and mission. Back in 1953, Congar called for an end to what he called hierarchology. Hierarchology, which is an ecclesiology based simply on the hierarchy. Hierarchology. And instead, he thought we needed to develop a total ecclesiology in which a theology of laity could be placed. 11 years later, in 1964, the Fathers of the Second Vatican Council published Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church. So we see that this conciliar theology of laity was not formulated in a vacuum. It was a result of decades of grappling with this emerging theology of the laity. Despite the toils and snares that Congar himself went through, if you know anything about his biography, he suffered greatly at the hands of the church. And yet his teaching now becomes the great resource for laity's vocation, mission, and spirituality at the council, as I hope my brief remarks this morning have demonstrated. Thank you very much.
We'd like to thank Aurelie Hagstrom for a magnificent talk, just rich with so much content. And please know that after this morning's event is over, as Bob Newton had mentioned, we will have this webcast, so we will have this video. And if we have your email address, which we do for most of you, and if we don't, please give it to us, we will send you the link so that you can actually rewatch, the morning's happenings. And then what we ask you to do is to spread the link and pass it on to your friends and family and people. That could be, a gift that just keeps giving. So we appreciate that. From one pioneering woman to another, I'd like to introduce to you Professor Laurie Johnston. Her background, she holds a degree from the University of Virginia and Harvard Divinity School, and as Bob had mentioned earlier, a PhD in theological ethics from Boston College. She is currently an assistant professor of religious studies at Emmanuel College, and as I mentioned earlier, she is the mother of 3 children, and when she doesn't have a sore knee, she's on a crutch right now, she is, as I mentioned, an avid ice hockey player. Do you just love that? Anyway, we are so pleased to introduce Miss Laurie Johnston.
Thank you. It's certainly a privilege to be back here under these circumstances, and also a privilege to follow Arlie. So thanks, Arlie, for a great introduction to Congar's theology. I, interestingly enough, did not encounter Congar first from as a theologian myself, but more in a personal way. I somehow managed to get through my whole PhD coursework at BC without ever reading any Congar, which is not a reflection on BC, but a reflection of my own ignorance. But I started reading Congar because I'm a member of the community of Sant'Egidio, a lay Catholic community, and I kept hearing Congar talked about in the context of that community. So I finally decided, well, I'm a theologian, I should go sit down and read him. And what I started to discover was not only was Congar a major theological influence on the community of Sant'Egidio in a number of ways, some of which I'll mention a little bit today, but he also was a personal friend to the community, which is kind of interesting because he was a very elderly man already by the time he met some of these young 20-something founders of the community of Sant'Egidio. So this was kind of a surprising friendship, but he actually, after the council, he was a member of the International Theological Commission and would travel to Rome frequently and would go and attend the prayer, the lay-led prayer of the community of Sant'Egidio quite regularly and found a kind of a home there. So it was a friendship that I think meant a lot to both sides of the friendship, even an unlikely one. When Congar had a neurological illness that ultimately rendered him an invalid and ultimately killed him, and he was in the hospital, actually a military veterans hospital in Paris, towards the end of his life. And so some of the members of Sant'Egidio would go and visit him there, and he was kind of a cranky old man in some ways. And would say, why are you wasting my time with these stupid questions? But then he would say, when are you coming back? When are you coming back? And so it was clear that he was also really fond of these visitors of his. So kind of an interesting relationship that I have inherited a little bit as a member of this same community. But obviously today my focus is more on the theological influence that Congar has had on Sant'Egidio, because those theological gifts that he gave, in particular to Sant'Egidio, but to all of us, are really important as we struggle today to figure out, okay, what does this actually mean in our current context? All of Congar's insights about the theology of the laity. And the first sort of theological gift that I want to talk about is Congar's sense of history. Arlie talked a little bit about how much Congar was one of the great thinkers of the ressourcement, the delving back into the tradition of the church, into the scriptures, into the church fathers, to find resources for reform. This was in many ways what inspired the council. But I think this sense of history was a really important source of Congar's courage as well. He was very innovative, and he suffered for it. He was silenced essentially for a long period, and so it took a lot of courage for him to continue developing his thought, continue writing. Obviously, he couldn't publish for a time, but I think this courage came from a sense that he was actually deeply rooted in the tradition, and he had faith that he would, in some way, be vindicated by the Holy Spirit, whether in his lifetime or not, he didn't know. But that understanding came from his study of history, and his understanding that Christians have lived out a Christian vocation in a whole range of different ways throughout history. And the structures of medieval Christendom that the church of his day had sort of inherited are not the only authentic forms of Christian life. There have been others. Yes, there's one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, but there is not one holy Catholic and Apostolic ecclesiology. So there's freedom then to innovate in ecclesiology. There have been, changes in it in the past. There can still be changes of it. And Congar wrote a massive study of ecclesiology throughout history, starting with St. Augustine, all the way up to the present day, where he showed all of the different variations in the way the church has understood itself throughout history. So this is what allowed Congar to see beyond the ideology of certain traditionalists, as they might have called themselves, or some people called them, to see that, okay, this traditionalism was actually a relatively new ideology. So he said, I don't want to be a conservative, but I want to be, and I am, a man of the tradition. And by this he meant the whole tradition, not just what the traditionalists thought the tradition was. And he says, this being a man of the tradition, as he wanted to be, this is another thing than immobility. This is not immobility. This is the presence of the one same principle in all the moments of the church's history. So there's one same principle that unifies the church's history, but it takes on very different forms. So his book, True and False Reform in the Church, was a really important expression of this idea that there's this one principle that endures, but through different expressions historically. And therefore, to remain faithful to the tradition, it has to evolve, it has to change in order to keep that one key principle alive. So he does offer some criteria for understanding, okay, so how do we help keep this basic principle of the church alive in new contexts? How do we recognize when it is evolving in a way that is faithful to the tradition versus totally departing from the tradition? And he said there's several key ways. First of all, you have to be sure that whatever reform you're working for is marked by charity, right? That there should be love for one another in the church, even in the context of reform. Then reform has to take place in communion with the whole body of believers. Okay, now, all right, maybe that's not 100% consensus. Consensus is not the same thing as communion, but there needs to be a communion of the body of believers to move forward together. And then he says, you need to be patient. And he, of course, is a very good example of patience. That reform is slow for good reasons. And the final criteria, he said, is authentic reform is always based on a return to sources in the tradition, a return to the scriptures, a return to practices of old. Of course, reinvented in new ways sometimes, but there has to be this process of returning as part of the process of renewal. So, and obviously Congar's theology itself, I think, models all of these characteristics, the sense of communion, the charity, the reminding of the tradition. So he wrote very hopefully, always, very hopefully about the church, even in the midst of his many trials and tribulations, because he knew the church's history. He saw what it had gone through in the past. And this gave him a sense that the church can continue to move forward into the future in new and creative ways. And a sense of history can really free all of us to invent new ways of living out the Christian calling as we move into the future. This is the freedom that a study of history gives you. And Congar said, look, the vocation and the mission of the laity is changing right now. He saw this in his own day. And here's what he said about it. He said, look, in the past, our notions of sainthood, for instance, were really influenced by the monastic ideal. So he says, look, the models of sainthood that we have up till now are chiefly patterns of renunciation of the world. So up till recently, husbands or wives were hardly ever canonized unless they had left their families. And great men of action were hardly ever canonized unless they had atoned for their activity. And normal, healthy people were not canonized unless they had ill-treated their bodies to the limit that life allows. So today he says, look, Christians have a different vocation, and we're starting to see a different kind of saint that represents this. So he says, our age seems to show that God's providential guidance is drawing the church as a whole to a form of holiness less opposed to the earthly life, towards a less narrowly monastic spirituality, one more adapted to men and women who desire wholeheartedly to practice the gospel perfectly and to live the Beatitudes, but feel called to do so in the world. This is very much what Arlie was talking about as well. That we are not to be dispensed from actively doing the world's works, but we are to do them without sin. So this is holiness, true holiness, but in the world. So obviously the idea that this is even possible is a major departure, and is part of what created problems for Congar theologically. He also got into trouble for being such an ecumenist, but his theology of the laity was a big part of what led to his silencing. So this sense of history that is freeing and that allows Congar to take the long view is something I think that's very important for us in the church today. If we become familiar with the ways that the church has experienced challenges and scandals in the past, which there are plenty of, it quickly becomes clear to us that it is not only our present-day bishops who are fallible, okay? It's not only our present-day orders of women religious who face challenges from church authorities in various ways. Okay? It's not only present-day parishes that are facing priest shortages. None of these things are new. I teach at Emmanuel College, which is run by the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, and they tell a story about their foundress, St. Julie Billiart, who really wanted to start a women's religious order. Well, guess what? Her bishop banned her. He said, no, sorry, you can't start a new women's religious order in my diocese. So guess what? She picked up and she moved to the next diocese, where the bishop was a little more opening and welcoming, and started a wonderful religious order that endures to this day. So I think there's a lesson for us in that. On the other hand, it's not only that we should look at the history of the church to gain perspective on struggles and challenges, but also because history has a lot to teach us about the beauty of the church. And this is something that Congar brought forth in many ways. He said by looking at this, the way that the beauty of the church, the action of the Holy Spirit has emerged in the past, we can become more attentive to the ways that beauty are emerging today and recognize it. So at the very end of his life, he was, like many, he was concerned about how the church was developing after the council and how things were going to turn out, basically. But he was very hopeful, and especially hopeful about the way lay people were taking up the vision of the council. And here's what he said. In this world, Christians must bring the responses of the gospel. That is, a response less reliant on the classical treasure of Catholic theology that comes out of the Middle Ages, and more reliant instead on the gospel and on the spiritual tradition of all the centuries of Christianity. In this regard, I have confidence in the new communities of prayer and of spiritual life, some of them even inspired by the spirituality of the ancient fathers. These communities that are closer to the contemporary world than to the theology inherited from the Middle Ages. The future of the church, in my view, rests greatly on the existence of small spiritual communities animated by a great devotion to the gospel and to evangelical practice, to the practice of love and charity, with the greatest liberty and sympathetic openness to what is happening in the world. This is the future of the church, a future which many communities realize, each one in its part, and therefore in a partial way, because we are all parts. No one in the church is everything. But the fact that these communities exist and that they are made up of people who are not out of the world, but live within the current of life, seems to me a quite important fact for the future of the church. That quote has a particular significance for me because it's actually from an article that Congar wrote for the publication of the community of Sant'Egidio. So he was implicitly talking about Sant'Egidio as one of those communities that he saw as a sign of hope. So I think Congar's ability to recognize these signs of hope and to befriend these long-haired Italian teenagers in the community of Sant'Egidio in the 70s is something that reveals one of his most admirable characteristics, actually, which was his ability to remain open to newness, even as an old man. I think there's a temptation for all of us to lament what we see as the degenerations of younger generations in the church and the loss of things. But even as an old man, Congar didn't give in to that kind of temptation. He continued to look at the future with real hope. So, for instance, in 1968, a lot of theologians, some of them quite well known, were really almost traumatized by the events of 1968, by the student protests, and really pulled back in shock from what was going on. But Congar did not. He actually, he had been preparing a revised edition of his great book, True and False Reform in the Church, and it was actually held up in the mail because there were mail strikes in Paris, of course, in the midst of all this. And so the publication was delayed. So he wrote another preface for it, in addition to the one he had already planned to do, where he talked about the student movements. And he said, the church needs to be open to what these students are saying. The church needs to take these students' concerns seriously and engage in genuine dialogue here. Okay, so that was unusual for this old man to say, let's dialogue, let's hear what they have to say and take it really seriously and change because of it. This is unusual. Another example, I think, of his openness to newness is his response to the emergence of liberation theology. Okay, he reviewed Gutierrez's book, A Theology of Liberation, when it first came out. And Gutierrez was already encountering some critics in Europe. But Congar spoke really positively about this new development of liberation theology and recognized it as something truly new, something different, something coming out of a truly different context. And he defends, in this review, he defends Gutierrez against his critics. And he says of one particular critic, has this person sufficiently entered into the perspective of the author whom he critiques and who lives a burdensome life in another world? Basically saying, what right does he have to critique Gutierrez? He doesn't understand. So this is a striking degree of openness in Congar to developments going on in the world. And where does this openness come from? Part of it is simply humility, I think. He was a truly humble man, a man of real prayer. Like that quote I just read earlier, he said, we are all parts in the church. No one in the church is everything. He had a strong sense of himself, too, as just a part. Obviously, a pretty important part, as you gathered from Arlie's talk, but humility. And because of that sense that he is just part, he had a strong sense that you have to leave a space. He called it the margin of charity. You have to leave a space for other people, other ways of thinking, as he did for Gutierrez, who you can tell he regards with a little bit of just confusion. He doesn't quite understand what's going on with liberation theology yet. It is really new, but he's ready to leave some space for it. This openness, though, also comes from a very particular theological point of view. Congar's understanding of salvation. Okay, he says, look, God's intention is not just to save the church and the people who are in the church. It's not even just to save humans. God's intention is to save the whole world. The whole world. This is a holistic view of salvation. And Congar says, look, the world around us, everything in it, people, whatever, is potentially graced, is destined for salvation, is yearning for that salvation. He quotes Romans, where Paul says, all of creation is yearning in anticipation of the eschaton, basically. And this is really how he sees the world, as yearning and moving towards that. Yes, in a flawed way, yes, in a partial way, but still, there's this momentum in the world. So this is what gives him a deeply positive view of the world. As Arlie was saying, he saw the secularity of the laity as a good thing. To be in the world is a good thing because the world is a fundamentally good thing. And so this is part of why he was able to talk about the secularity of lay people in such a positive way. But here's one of the ways he explains this vision of salvation. This is a very good image, I think. Ontologically, this is the world that, transformed and renewed, will pass into the kingdom. So final salvation will be achieved by a wonderful refloating of our earthly vessel, rather than by a transfer of the survivors to another ship wholly built by God. Okay? So a wonderful refloating of our earthly vessel, rather than by a transfer of the survivors to another ship. Okay? So this means that our earthly vessel is something to be taken very seriously and something to take responsibility for. Congar says, we're pilgrims in this world, yes, but that doesn't mean we're tourists. So we have a responsibility for transforming the entire world. But he says, in order to really do this, we have to change our perspective. He says, Catholics, in particular, need to move beyond their ordinary horizons and develop what he calls a more truly Catholic soul. Less provincial, less stay-at-home, less inclined to see error in what is merely unaccustomed, a soul eager to broaden itself to the best of its powers, to the utmost bounds of the truth, of the good, of life, of mankind, and God's plan for it. I like that quote. Okay, of course, yes, the world is colored by sin. Any human effort in the world is going to be colored by sin, but that doesn't mean it doesn't also contain elements of salvation. So the world's salvation is really a cooperative effort in a certain way. Congar uses this other image that if we're thinking about our work for the kingdom versus God's grace at work bringing about the kingdom, it's like two artists. So a master artist gets his pupil to make a sketch and then takes it over himself and transfigures it with matchless skill, but without failing to work into his picture what the unskilled hand had tried to draw. The original sketch is not obliterated. So this means what ordinary Christians do in their daily lives becomes part of this grander sketch of salvation. So, one way in which Congar continued to talk about this, though, even after the council, and this, I think I want to extend a little bit part of what Arlie was saying. He said, okay, we are drawing this sketch of salvation in the world. Lay people are. And he had been so focused on talking about the legitimacy of lay people's mission in the world, that lay people are called to transform the world, that it's good to be in the world. And at a certain point, he started to step back and say, later on in his life, well, okay, lay people are also in the church. I've been talking so much about lay people in the world, and that's a good thing, and here's the mission and whatever. Well, lay people are also in the church. The church is the people of God. Okay? So really, if baptism is what gives us all of our vocation, and we're all called to do the church's mission in the world, we're also all called to be responsible for the internal life of the church. He said, I'd been focused so much on the laity, doing the external mission. Well, the laity have a responsibility ad intra, too. And when he really started to think about the implications of this, he realized, okay, I've been working for so long on trying to explain who the laity are. Well, if we're all called to this one vocation, to this one mission, really, it's the clergy that need explanation. Who are they? We are all one, and then yet there's this one group set aside. They're the ones we have to figure out, why are they here? I'm exaggerating a little bit, but this is truly a realization that he came to understand. And so he didn't fully really get a chance to think through, okay, what does it mean for the laity to also have a responsibility for the interior life of the church? And by this he means the spiritual life, the life of prayer. Okay? It's not just, it's liturgy as well. This isn't, I don't think this is so surprising to us who are accustomed to seeing lay people, doing the readings, lay Eucharistic ministers, this kind of thing. But I think part of what Congar was also talking about was these communities that he described emerging, where lay people were initiating and leading prayer. I like to think, I don't know if this is true, but I like to think that maybe this change in Congar's understanding might have come about from attending those Sant'Egidio prayers in Rome, where he experienced lay-led prayer, perhaps, for one of the first times in his life. So I think, let's see, if I might, then I might address the question about Voice of the Faithful a little bit here, because this is part of what I'm trying to get at. When Congar said, look, the laity are responsible for the church too, in a way I think he was also saying the laity are free. And when we ask questions about, okay, why, what do we do when the hierarchy bans us or something? Congar's own example, I think, is a really fascinating response to that, because he didn't stop doing what he was doing. He kept writing, he kept thinking, he kept teaching as he was permitted. And so there's a way in which I feel like when we say, well, what if the hierarchy bans us? We're still being dependent upon the hierarchy, right? We haven't totally understood Congar's new ecclesiology because we're waiting for a priest or a bishop to do something. When Congar is saying, no, it's your mission to do something. So, okay, you can't meet in this church. Do what the early Christians did. Form a house church. Okay? Not outside of the structures of the church, not apart from, not out of communion. And by all means, he, of course, would love the church and would urge ongoing dialogue with others in the church, with the faith that the Holy Spirit will ultimately point the way forward for everyone. But this idea that the laity are full citizens, are truly responsible, ultimately means that they have the freedom to initiate. Okay? There's no one saying, okay, I'm sorry, you can't start praying. I'm sorry, you can't go start a ministry to immigrants in, wherever. What's to stop you? Nothing. Congar says we're full citizens. This is our mission, all of us. And I think we lose that sometimes. Congar lived through a lot. He saw the world in some ways at its worst. He saw the church in some ways at its worst, shriveled up in a lot of ways. I think would be a good way to describe his experience of it. He lived in a prisoner of war camp for most of World War II. In World War I, he was a small child watching soldiers and writing about them in his journal and writing about the violence he witnessed even. So this is somebody who saw the evil in the world and yet continued to hope in the salvation of the world, continued to hope in the future possibilities of the church. And he didn't give up his basic faith in the goodness that was going to perdure. And so I think his legacy to us is a reminder to embrace our freedom as Christians, the freedom to envision a new world, and the freedom to invent new forms of Christian life, new ways to live this same gospel that has been this key principle throughout the tradition that he loved so much. So, thank you very much.